Hey guys, what's up? It's Nate, and it's time for another bite size. If you've been watching slash listening to us for any amount of time, you know that these bite size segments tend to be, well, one a little shorter as a usual as a general rule. A bite size segment does tend to be a little shorter, but also they tend to be a little more freeform, not as, and we don't, full disclosure, we don't really script anything. A lot of it's just pretty conversational. Um, we do have sometimes, not all the time. So sometimes we do have like notes and sort of an outline to work off of. But a lot of times with these bite size, it tends to be a lot more stream of consciousness kind of, or very loosely organized, or I do like 18 million takes before I finally figure out how I want to say, how I'm going to say what I want to say, which again, like I could probably just sit down, write down stuff for a few minutes and yeah, probably save myself a little bit of frustration. But that being said, it's a bite size. And the working title for this one, I'm gonna say "Be Not Afraid," which, depending on where this ends up going, you may say, Nate, that's not quite the best title you've ever had. But we are in the middle of spooky season. Like by the time this airs, it'll be smack dab the middle of well, pretty much the middle of October. It'll be, or really close, because I think, yeah, 31 days. So yeah, 16th is technically the very middle. But so October 31st is Halloween, Reformation Day, a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B. Um, it's also, just like I said, it's spooky season. Like here at the breakdown, we usually do what we call like Spooktober. So we do have like a spooky-ish game that we're going to be doing an episode on here in the fairly immediate future. But that's not what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is just sort of, well, I want to talk about fear and I want to talk about horror and just some thoughts that I have on those two things. So there's this devotional that I've been utilizing, and I'm fairly certain that Akasha from the Discord was the one who had recommended it a while ago. I can't remember the title of this off. I could probably go to the room next door, get the book, look at it, and tell you. But that's I'm not going to do that, because you know what? Just stay. Just we'll sort of set the hook, and if you want to find out what it's called, check back in next week, because I'm probably going to talk about it for the full app. But it's a it's a devotional. I do think it might be called "Don't Look Away," but it's a devotional that sort of leans into and is utilizing the horror, the horrific imagery, and actually some of the horror narrative found in the Bible. And I think that's pretty interesting, um, because frankly, I do think we tend to sterilize a lot of biblical narrative. We've turned things like Daniel and the Lion's Den into almost a fairy story, like Noah's Ark. We wallpaper kids' bedrooms with like nurseries with Noah's Ark wallpaper and stuff like that. And these are pretty horrific events. Like these are God pouring out his judgment on humanity, and uh, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people dying in the flood. And we don't know what the population was at that point in time. So, um, but the vast majority of life on Earth was just annihilated. Um, and drowning, I've got to be honest, like it's probably not one of my favorite ways to go. Uh, but like to just think about theoretically. So there's that, and I think it has been really interesting, and I just think, so that's kind of got me going. But we're also, dude, it's October, so the leaves are turning red and gold and they're falling off the trees, and it's really pretty, but it's also like a little sad, a little like kind of like morose, and we're right before like the skeletal stage. So it's sort of, there's still like a little bit of like cozy vibes. But yeah, I just, thematically, I always kind of I do appreciate how October just does feel like Halloween does feel very appropriate for October just because of like the way the world is sort of like happen like the way the seasons are uh, ha- happening, falling, whatever, the way it's work, the way they it just like thematically like it checks out for me, and I like that, and I think it just kind of makes sense. Now I also recognize not everybody experiences autumn the way that I do, in my particular latitude and longitude and everything else like that, but yeah. But also, like, this is a time of year where I actually sort of indulge in like spookier stuff as a general rule with a little bit more frequency. Um, Earlier, sort of leading up to this month, I listened to, but I had read it years ago, anyways. But I listened to Stephen King's The Stand, and it's really hard to recommend that book because even though Stephen King is he's probably he's a really great writer. And I think The Stand is a really pretty phenomenal piece of fiction. There's also like Stephen King does this thing where he sort of likes to get a little perverse, a little gross. And there's a lot of stuff in there that I just wouldn't recommend to most audiences. Um, yeah, and maybe you're saying like, well, then why'd you read it, Nate? Well, it's like, well, one, I kind of forgot it was in there, but two, I don't know. I'm stupid. I don't always make great decisions. But, one of the things I did really appreciate was just his portrayal of and this is I guess we're gonna do some light spoilers, but the primary antagonist, the villain of the book is a guy that goes by the name Randall Flagg. Um, but he's also, the man in black, the dark man. He's got a bunch of pseudonyms, and he's actually sort of like I don't know, like I don't think this is that big a spoiler, but he's actually like a character uh, shows up in several of King's books, and he's sort of like he's a demon essentially. Um, in The Stand, there's a character who says he's not Lucifer, but he knows him, and they keep company. And I don't know. I think that was an interesting way to. But he's an ancient evil, and just like the pettiness and the cruelty and the malice and kind of like at times the stupidity really reminds me actually of Lewis um, when he's in Paralandra and the Unman. Um, just kind of like there's kind of a maliciousness and a cruelty, and yeah. Anyways, I just like it's a really interesting study. Just and like I said, Sting's or Stephen King Sting. Uh, Sting is a pretty interesting musician. Um, I think he's still alive. I don't think Sting has died yet. I don't know. Yeah, anyways, but Stephen King is a really good writer, but again, really hard to recommend him just because he's kind of skeevy. But yeah, but anyway, so it's like it's Spooktober. We're playing Dredge this year, and so next week there's going to be an episode for you guys on that, and I think that'll be a fun one. I have played it. I really enjoyed it. I have some thoughts, and if you want to find out about those as well as the actual name of that book that I was mentioning earlier, you can just listen next week, and then you'll know those things instead of just sort of like speculating. Anyways, but here's what I wanted to go. One of the other things, like I've made no bones about it, is like lately, within the last couple of years, I've really gotten into sort of like cryptids and Nephilim and all of that stuff. And this is actually kind of like one of my favorite times of year to sort of like dig into those. Um, and maybe it's not the wisest thing in the world because, like, as a kid, I avoided horror as a general rule because I had a pretty overactive imagination, and I would say that it hasn't completely abandoned me. So like sometimes these things get into my head and they don't leave me alone. But as I've spent time sort of studying these things and thinking about the very real threats that these preternatural um, adversaries present, it kind of leads me to just some meditations about fear in general, and frankly, some of the usefulness of it. Um, so one of the things that I kind of wanted to, and this isn't gonna be super long because it's a bite size, and because, like, I don't know that I have a ton to say here. But I actually think it's good for us to be afraid. And I think, like, and I'm not talking about like the fear mongering that the modern 24-hour news cycle or social media sort of engages in, where it's constantly feeding you things, whether they're real or not, to be afraid of. Um, I'm talking about like just recognizing that the world is kind of a scary place. It's kind of a dangerous place. There was a Twitter account years ago that I used to follow, and I think it was just called "The World or Nature is Scary," and it would just show you these insane, like, sort of natural, like, creatures that were just like wildly deadly, or would sort of spit out like these factoids about like all the different ways that weather could kill you or whatever, and it was just pretty wild, and it was a useful reminder because here's the thing. I think we live in a world, and I have a lot of thoughts about this, but I think pre-COVID, a lot of us were really, really comfortable. And we sort of lived under this illusion that we were way safer than we actually were. And we weren't, and I'm not going to get into the merits of the COVID threats, etc. Like, but the fact is, like, the human experience is fragile. I actually just this last weekend went to a funeral of a high school friend of mine. He was a couple years younger than me, and it was really sad. Um, Now, granted, there's some mitigating circumstances, and I'm not going to get into that, but like, life is kind of fragile, and as you get older, especially, like, you become just sort of disabused of the, like, you have this sort of like this almost like notion of your immortality when you're younger, and as you get older you get like pretty quickly like sort of like, nah, that ain't the case, friend. But the fact is, I think horror is useful in sort of sometimes reminding us that there are things in the night that go bump, or that, I guess, the way that people normally say it, things that go bump in the night. There are threats and dangers, and there are monsters. Sometimes those monsters are sort of disguised as people. And I'm not talking about skinwalkers or anything like that. Of course, like, that's something totally different and also pretty spooky. But I'm talking about just people whose moral compass has just completely, like, they're just their consciences, their consciences. I hate that. I'm saying that word. Their conscience is completely seared. Um, and that it just, like, they've been given over to their own appetites. I think one of something, Heath Ledger's performance as the Joker was sort of like, it was absolutely, like, he he crushed it, but it was also like kind of terrifying because there was, like, he was demonstrating an individual who's just completely untethered and just sort of lives by just malicious whim. um but And that's a threat. That's a reality, I think, that we need to be aware of and sort of think about from time to time. But I think it's good to get those reminders that, like, maybe we aren't as safe as we think we are. Now, I'm going to say all that, right? But what I'm going to sort of follow that up with is that, like, ultimately, I think for the believer, we know that Jesus, the God man, the King of the universe, has his foot firmly on the serpent's head, and that all evil, all wickedness, all maliciousness, will ultimately answer to him. And none of that happens without him allowing it. And so, like, for believers, there's a peace that surpasses understanding. Um, but I think sometimes, yeah, it's just, but that doesn't change the fact that, like, sometimes those threats are there, and that maybe we need to think about those things and plan accordingly. Um, yeah, it's like even some of the diaconal work I've had to sort of engage in lately has actually really challenged me to think about maybe some realities that I'd rather not. Um, and, I'm not going to get into the specifics, but all that all that I'm saying is that I really think that, yeah, there's there's a usefulness, and I think, like, I don't think it's useful to be obsessed. Like, I think there are some people who sort of, like, one, if you're one of those people that sort of like makes Halloween like your whole identity, like, that's, frankly, that's really lame. I think Halloween is a lot of fun. I like spooky season, dude, and I love candy. Um, I'm also not opposed to Reformation Day, to celebrating Martin Luther having nailed the 95 Theses to the door. Um, but I think, like, this time of year, it's a useful prompt for maybe to think about, like, just the reality of that stuff and how these things are dangerous, how they do present threats to our physicality. And ultimately, like, we know that nothing happens. Like, it's like one of those things where we can rest confidently in the fact that, all things work for the good of those who love him, and all things work for the good of God's people and for his glory. And so we can take peace and we can take comfort in that. But I do also think it's useful and it's helpful to sort of maybe think about things and sort of weigh them seriously, and just sort of, yeah, it's okay to be afraid, not in a way that paralyzes you, but maybe in a way that provokes you, to think and maybe to prepare. Again, not to terrify you, but also, like, ultimately you can take all of those things and you can sort of lay all of the anxieties and all the worries at the feet of mighty King Jesus, because he's got it. Like, so yeah, it's kind of tempting this time of year to maybe, like, go down rabbit holes. Like, and I love it. Like, listen, full disclosure, like, I'm getting caught up on, like, Haunted Cosmos stuff right now. Um, I might go back and listen to some of their scarier stuff just because I kind of like it. Like, I kind of like being scared, like, spooked out. Like, I like getting a little bit of the heebie-jeebies right now. But I think what's more important is that, like, when I'm done sort of getting, like, the willies, right? I can turn around and I can praise God for his generosity and his kindness towards me and for his provision. Um, so yeah. Anyways, all that being said, guys, like, this one was gonna be kind of loosey goosey. So yeah. Anyways, um, yeah. So be scared, but not too scared, and actually just be not afraid. Like, and that's so corny, and I hate that I said that, but it's true, because, yeah, most cliches are. But anyways, you know the deal. You guys know the things, do the things, and until next time, well, I'll see you next time. Later.